I was standing in my kitchen last Tuesday morning, my 62-year-old hands wrapped around the same coffee mug I'd used for 20 years, when the phone rang with news that made my knees buckle. The voice on the other end was shaking. "Mrs. Patterson? This is Detective Morrison from the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. We need to talk to you about something that happened to your grandfather, 40 years ago. 40 years ago. The mug slipped from my fingers and shattered across the linoleum floor I'd been meaning to replace since my divorce. Coffee splashed against my ankles, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. "Ma'am? Are you there?" All I could do was stare at the framed photo on my kitchen counter, the one of Grandpa Joe and his best friend Eddie, arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning like they owned the world. It was taken in 1983, just months before everything fell apart. Before the betrayal that destroyed my grandfather's life and sent our family into a spiral we never quite recovered from. Ma'am, what I'm about to tell you, it's going to sound impossible. But nothing about this call surprised me anymore. Because I'd learned, in my 6 decades on this earth, that the universe has a way of keeping score. Even when we think someone has gotten away with murder, literally, time has a way of catching up. Especially when they think they're untouchable. Eddie Morrison had been untouchable for 40 years. Protected by his badge, his reputation, his carefully constructed lies. While my grandfather died alone and broken, Eddie lived in a mansion on the hill, collecting his pension, playing golf every Tuesday. Until last Tuesday morning, when karma finally came calling. If this story is already stirring something in your heart, I'd love to know, what time is it where you are right now and which city or state are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. Let's see how far this story is reaching. My name is Sarah Patterson and I'm 62 years old. Old enough to remember when gas cost 89 cents a gallon, when you could leave your doors unlocked, and when a man's word still meant something. Old enough to have worry lines etched deep around my eyes and liver spots freckling the backs of my hands that once changed my children's diapers and later held my mother's hand as she passed. I've lived through 3 marriages, raised 4 children, buried both my parents and survived cancer twice. My hair is more silver than brown now and I need reading glasses that hang from a chain around my neck. The same kind my grandmother wore, though I swore I'd never become that woman. But some stories age with you. They settle into your bones and stay there, growing heavier with each passing year. This is one of those stories. It begins in 1983 in a small town called Millbrook, nestled in the California foothills where everyone knew everyone else's business. Or thought they did. Where my grandfather Joe lived in the same house his father built with his own hands, on the same street where he'd grown up, married my grandmother and raised my mother. Grandpa Joe was 65 then, the same age I am now. A gentle man with calloused hands and kind eyes who'd worked construction his whole life, building homes for other families while his own stayed rooted in that little blue house with the white picket fence that needed painting every few years. I can still smell his Old Spice aftershave and hear the jingle of change in his pockets. He had one best friend in the whole world, Eddie Morrison. They'd been inseparable since childhood, served in Vietnam together, stood as each other's best man, were godfathers to each other's children. Eddie was a police detective by then, 23 years on the force. Respected, trusted, the kind of man people looked up to. The kind of man who could get away with anything. Back then I was 22, fresh out of college, planning my wedding to my first husband. Life stretched ahead of me like an unwritten book, full of possibility and promise. I thought the worst thing that could happen was rain on my wedding day or forgetting my lines in the ceremony. How naive I was. I had no idea that in the space of 6 months, my grandfather's life would be destroyed, our family would be shattered, and I would learn that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones capable of the deepest betrayal. But that Tuesday morning phone call, 40 years later, proved that sometimes, just sometimes, the truth refuses to stay buried. To understand what happened, you have to understand what Grandpa Joe and Eddie were to each other. They weren't just friends, they were brothers in every way that mattered. They met in 3rd grade when Eddie's family moved to Millbrook from Los Angeles. Joe was the first kid to talk to the new boy with the 2 small clothes and shoes with holes in them. While other children whispered about Eddie's father who drank too much and his mother who worked 3 jobs, Joe invited Eddie home for dinner. My great-grandmother, God rest her soul, took one look at that skinny boy and started setting an extra place at the table every night. Eddie practically lived at our house growing up. He and Grandpa Joe shared everything: baseball cards, bicycles, dreams of adventure beyond the small town limits. I have photographs from those early years. Faded black and white images of two boys fishing at Miller's Creek, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, gap-toothed grins stretching from ear to ear. In every single photo they're touching somehow. A hand on a shoulder, arms linked, heads bent together over some shared secret. They were inseparable. During high school, when Eddie's father finally drank himself to death and his mother couldn't afford the rent anymore, Eddie moved in with my great-grandparents officially. Shared Grandpa Joe's room, his clothes, his chores, his everything. My great-grandfather used to joke that he'd gotten 2 sons for the price of one, but I could see the love in his eyes when he said it. Eddie was smart, smarter than Grandpa Joe in some ways. He made better grades, understood numbers and business concepts that made my grandfather's head spin. But Joe had something Eddie lacked, an innate goodness, a moral compass that never wavered. Where Eddie could be calculating and ambitious, Joe was steady and kind. Maybe that should have been a warning. When Vietnam came calling in 1968, they enlisted together. Of course they did. Grandpa Joe would later tell me stories of how they watched each other's backs in the jungle, how Eddie had saved his life during an ambush near Da Nang, how they'd made a pact in a foxhole under mortar fire that they'd always be there for each other no matter what. Blood brothers, Grandpa Joe called it. They'd even cut their palms with Eddie's knife and pressed them together, letting their blood mingle in the red dirt of a foreign country while explosions lit up the sky around them. No matter what. The war changed them both as war changes all men. They came home quieter with shadows in their eyes that hadn't been there before. Eddie in particular seemed harder somehow, more distant. But their friendship remained solid, or so we all thought. Joe married my grandmother Margaret in 1970, and Eddie stood beside him at the altar in his dress uniform, tears streaming down his face as he handed over the rings. When Eddie married Susan 3 years later, Joe returned the favor, giving a speech about brotherhood and loyalty that had half the congregation weeping. They bought houses 2 streets apart in Millbrook. Modest little places with white picket fences and big backyards perfect for raising children. My mother and her sister on one side, Eddie's 2 boys Marcus and David on the other. The kids grew up more like siblings than friends, spending summers racing between the 2 houses, building forts in both backyards, sharing birthday parties and Christmas mornings. It was beautiful. It was perfect. It was a lie. I remember those Sunday dinners like scenes from a Norman Rockwell painting. 20 people crowded around my grandmother's dining room table, passing bowls of mashed potatoes and arguing good-naturedly about baseball scores and politics. Eddie would always bring dessert, expensive pastries from the bakery in the next town over, not the homemade cakes the rest of us contributed. A man's got to have some luxuries, he'd say with that charming smile of his. Life's too short for store-bought cookies. Even then there were signs. Little things that didn't quite add up. Eddie always had the nicest car, the newest gadgets, clothes that cost more than a detective's salary should have allowed. When anyone asked about it, he'd wink and talk about smart investments, lucky breaks in the stock market, Susan's mysterious inheritance from a great-aunt nobody had ever met. We believed him because we wanted to. Because Eddie Morrison was family and you don't question family. Not even when maybe you should. By 1983, both men were in their 60s. Joe had recently retired from construction, his back finally giving out after 40 years of carrying heavy loads and crawling under houses. The doctor said another year might have left him permanently disabled, so he took his pension and tried to figure out what to do with the rest of his life. Eddie was still working, a detective with the Millbrook Police Department, well-respected and just a few years away from his own retirement. He'd risen through the ranks steadily, earning commendations for his work on difficult cases, building a reputation as a man you could trust with sensitive investigations. The perfect cover for a criminal. That's when Eddie suggested they start the business together. Joe had always been handy, he could fix anything with moving parts. Cars, tractors, generators, you name it. People had been bringing their broken machines to him for years, paying him cash under the table for repairs the dealers said were impossible. Eddie had the connections and the business sense. He knew everyone in town through his police work, understood contracts and regulations, had the kind of reputation that opened doors and inspired confidence. "We'd be perfect partners, Joe," Eddie said over beers one evening in Joe's garage. "You've got the skills, I've got the connections. We could build something real here. Something to leave our kids." The idea appealed to Grandpa Joe in ways I don't think he fully understood at the time. He'd worked his whole life building other people's dreams, Houses for families he'd never meet, structures that would outlast him but never bear his name. This would be different. This would be his. So they opened Morrison & Sons Auto Repair in a small garage on the outskirts of town. The name bothered me even then. Why Morrison first? Why not Sullivan and Morrison? But Grandpa Joe just shrugged when I asked. Eddie's the businessman, he said. Let him handle the details. Those details would destroy him. I remember the day they signed the partnership papers. I was there with my mother and grandmother, watching as these two men who'd been through so much together shook hands and grinned like teenagers planning their first adventure. Grandpa Joe was so proud. He kept talking about legacy, about finally building something that would last, something that would give him purpose in his retirement years. 40 years I've been fixing other people's problems, he said. Now I get to fix my own. If only we'd known. The garage became everything to Grandpa Joe. He'd arrive at 6 in the morning before the sun came up and work until sunset. His weathered hands, scarred from decades of construction work, found new purpose bringing dying engines back to life. He had a gift for diagnosis. He could listen to an engine and tell you exactly what was wrong, could spot problems that younger mechanics missed. Word spread quickly about his skill. People drove from 3 counties over to have Joe Sullivan look at their cars. Farmers with tractors that hadn't run in years. Young mothers with station wagons on their last legs. Classic car enthusiasts who trusted their babies to no one else. Your grandfather's got magic in his hands, one customer told me. He can make the dead live again. Within 6 months they had more business than they could handle. Cars lined up in the gravel lot outside the garage, waiting for Joe's attention. The cash register, an old mechanical beast that required muscle to operate, rang constantly. That's when Eddie suggested they expand. We're turning away customers, Joe. Think about that, we're turning away money. Eddie had spreadsheets and projections, charts that showed their potential profit if they could just invest in better equipment, hire a few employees, maybe lease the building next door for additional bays. The American dream, Joe. This is what we fought for in Vietnam, the chance to build something bigger than ourselves. Grandpa Joe was hesitant. He'd lived through the Depression, had seen what debt could do to a family. His own father had lost everything in 1932, had spent years rebuilding from nothing. Debt is a chain, his father had always said. And chains get heavier the longer you wear them. But Eddie was persuasive. He understood numbers in ways that made Joe's head spin, talked about leverage and cash flow and return on investment. Most importantly, he had the bank's attention. Eddie Morrison was collateral you could trust. A decorated police detective with 25 years of spotless service and connections throughout the county. Trust me, Joe, Eddie had said, his hand on my grandfather's shoulder, his eyes sincere and earnest. Have I ever steered you wrong? So Grandpa Joe signed the papers. Put up his house, the house his father had built with his own hands, as collateral for a $50,000 loan. In 1983 that was serious money. Life-changing money. House-buying money. Or house-losing money as it turned out. For 3 months, everything went according to plan. Business was booming. They hired 2 full-time mechanics, Jerry Hoffman, a kid fresh out of trade school, and Samuel Chin, a veteran who'd learned engines in the Army. They also brought in a part-time bookkeeper, Mrs. Davidson, a widow who'd managed the books for her late husband's hardware store. Eddie handled all the finances while Joe focused on what he did best, fixing cars and making customers happy. It was a perfect division of labor, or so it seemed. Every Friday Eddie would show Joe the books. Neat columns of numbers showing income and expenses, profit and loss. The business was making money, good money. Enough to cover the loan payments with plenty left over for reinvestment and modest salaries for both partners. We're building something special here, Joe, Eddie would say, pointing to the growing balance in their business account. Something our boys can take over someday. Joe trusted Eddie completely. When Eddie said the books looked good, Joe believed him. When Eddie said they needed to reinvest profits back into the business, Joe agreed. When Eddie suggested they take out a second loan to buy the building instead of leasing it, Joe signed where Eddie pointed. Trust. Such a small word for something so powerful and so fragile. Every Sunday after church, our families would gather at someone's house for dinner. 20 people crowded around tables that groaned under the weight of my grandmother's cooking. Pot roast and mashed potatoes, green beans from the garden, apple pie that made your eyes roll back in your head. The children would play in the yard while the adults sat on the porch talking about the future. Eddie would regale us with carefully edited stories from his police work, always mindful not to reveal too much, but enough to remind everyone that he was a man who upheld justice, who could be trusted with the community's most important secrets. Grandpa Joe would beam with pride when Eddie talked about their business, how they were building something special together. 35 years of friendship, he'd say, raising his beer bottle in a toast, and we're just getting started. I can still see his face when he said those words. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners, the genuine joy in his voice when he talked about working alongside his best friend. He believed in Eddie Morrison the way some people believe in God, completely, without question, with everything he had. That faith would destroy him. Because while Grandpa Joe was under the hood of cars, covered in grease and focused on honest work, Eddie Morrison was stealing from him. Systematically, carefully, cleverly. Eddie had access to everything. The business account, the deposit slips, the customer payments. As the business manager, he handled all financial transactions. When customers paid cash, Eddie made the deposits. When bills came in, Eddie wrote the checks. When tax time came, Eddie prepared the paperwork. The perfect setup for the perfect crime. And when it all came crashing down, Eddie had made sure that all the evidence pointed in one direction. Away from himself. And straight at my grandfather. The first sign of trouble came on a Thursday morning in November 1983. I remember because it was 3 days before my 23rd birthday, and I was supposed to have lunch with Grandpa Joe to finalize plans for my engagement party. Instead, I found him sitting at his kitchen table, staring at a letter from the bank with the kind of expression I'd only seen once before, when they told him Grandma Margaret's cancer had spread. "Sarah, honey," he said when I walked in, his voice hollow. "I think there's been some kind of mistake." The letter was a notice of default. According to the bank, Morrison & Sons Auto Repair was 3 months behind on loan payments. Not just the original $50,000. Apparently there was a third loan I'd never heard of, for another $75,000. "That's impossible," I said, because it was. I'd helped them balance the business checkbook just the month before. The garage was making money hand over fist. But Grandpa Joe's hands were shaking as he showed me the documentation. His signature on loan papers he didn't remember signing. Bank statements showing withdrawals he didn't remember making. The coffee in his mug had gone cold hours ago, a thin film forming on top that reminded me of ice on a pond. "Eddie handles all the paperwork," he kept saying, running his weathered fingers through what was left of his gray hair. "Eddie takes care of the money stuff. He said business was good. He said we were ahead of projections." I studied the bank statements more carefully, my heart sinking with each line item. Large cash withdrawals always on days when Eddie was working alone at the garage. Checks written to companies I'd never heard of, business consulting services, and equipment maintenance fees that seemed suspiciously vague. "Grandpa, when did you sign authorization for these withdrawals?" He looked at me with eyes that seemed older than his 65 years. "I didn't. At least, I don't remember." Eddie said there were so many papers to sign for the expansion. Insurance forms, tax documents, vendor agreements. Maybe I signed something without reading it carefully enough. That's exactly what Eddie had been counting on. We drove to the garage together, my grandfather's face gray as winter sky. I'd never seen him look so old, so fragile. This man who'd survived war and loss and decades of backbreaking work seemed to shrink before my eyes, his broad shoulders curving inward like he was trying to disappear. The November air was sharp with the promise of winter, and I could see our breath as we walked from the car to the garage bay where Grandpa Joe had spent the happiest months of his retirement. The place that had given him such purpose now felt ominous, shadows lurking in corners where sunlight used to dance. Eddie was there, of course, in his pressed khakis and polo shirt, looking every inch the successful businessman. He was talking to Jerry Hoffman, one of their mechanics, gesturing animatedly about some repair procedure. The picture of a man without a care in the world. When Grandpa Joe showed him the bank letter, Eddie's face went through a careful performance of shock, confusion, and then something that looked almost like sorrow. But I was watching his eyes, and for just a split second, so brief I almost missed it, I saw satisfaction flash across his features. "Fisto, I don't understand this either. Let me make some calls." But even then, watching Eddie's reaction, something felt wrong to me. The way his eyes didn't quite meet my grandfather's. The way his hands stayed steady when Grandpa Joe's were trembling. The way he immediately moved to take control of the situation, gathering up the papers like he needed to protect them from scrutiny. "I'll handle this, Joe. Don't worry about it. These banks make mistakes all the time, especially with small businesses. I've got contacts who can straighten this out quietly." Women's intuition maybe. Or maybe I was just starting to see what love had blinded my grandfather to. That afternoon I stayed at the garage and watched Eddie work. Really watched him. The way he handled the cash register when customers paid, carefully counting bills before sliding them into his pocket instead of the cash drawer. The way he intercepted phone calls before they could reach my grandfather, stepping outside to take conversations he claimed were boring business stuff. "Sarah, honey, why don't you help your grandfather with that transmission? This is just paperwork nonsense." But I'd seen him slip 3 $20 bills into his wallet while my grandfather's back was turned. Payment from Mrs. Henderson for fixing her station wagon's carburetor. Money that should have gone into the business account. When I mentioned it to Grandpa Joe later, he just shrugged. Eddie fronts a lot of expenses from his own pocket. Gas for runs to the parts store, lunch for the mechanics, that sort of thing. He's probably just reimbursing himself. Always an explanation. Always a reason that made Eddie look generous and responsible. Over the next 2 weeks, more bills arrived at Grandpa Joe's house like a steady drumbeat of doom. Suppliers claiming they hadn't been paid for parts delivered months ago. Equipment rental companies threatening to repossess machinery my grandfather was certain they'd bought outright. The IRS demanding quarterly tax payments that should have been made in September. Each envelope brought fresh confusion and heartbreak. I watched my grandfather age years in those 14 days, the stress etching new lines around his eyes and stealing the spring from his step. Every night, Grandpa Joe would sit at that kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of papers, trying to make sense of numbers that didn't add up. The kitchen light cast harsh shadows across his face, making him look like a defendant already convicted. I'd find him there at 2 in the morning, his reading glasses fogged with tears of frustration. "I don't understand, Sarah. We had money. I saw the deposits. I signed the checks myself." Except he hadn't. Not all of them. Eddie had signing authority on the business accounts, a practical arrangement for a busy auto shop, or so it had seemed. When customers paid, Eddie made the deposits. When bills came in, Eddie wrote the checks. When suppliers called with questions, Eddie handled the conversations. The perfect setup for the perfect betrayal. I started keeping a notebook, writing down every discrepancy I could find. Customers who claimed they'd paid cash but whose payments didn't show up in the business records. Invoices for parts that were never delivered. Bank statements that showed a thriving business one month and mounting debts the next. The pattern was clear if you knew how to look for it. Eddie was always helpful during those awful weeks. Always ready with explanations that almost made sense. The bank must have made an error. They were notorious for sloppy bookkeeping with small business accounts. The suppliers were probably targeting successful garages with false claims, hoping to get paid twice for the same work. These things happened all the time in small towns where everybody knew everybody else's business. "The vultures circle when they smell blood," Eddie said one afternoon, his arm around my grandfather's shoulders in a gesture that now looked predatory instead of supportive. "But don't worry, Joe. I won't let them destroy what we've built together." But when Grandpa Joe suggested they hire an independent accountant to audit the books, Eddie had reasons why that wasn't necessary. Too expensive for a business already struggling with cash flow. Too time-consuming when they needed to focus on bringing in revenue. Too risky. Accountants were required to report certain irregularities to the IRS, and did they really want to invite that kind of scrutiny? "I've got contacts at the bank who can straighten this out quietly," Eddie insisted. "Let me handle it my way first. If that doesn't work, we'll consider other options. Trust me, Joe. Haven't I always looked out for you?" But Eddie's contacts at the bank seemed remarkably unhelpful. Each week brought new delays, new complications, new excuses for why the errors couldn't be corrected quickly. Meanwhile, the interest on the overdue loans kept accumulating, and the foreclosure notices kept coming. I remember one particularly brutal afternoon when Eddie sat my grandfather down for what he called a come-to-Jesus conversation about the business finances. I was in the office supposedly organizing parts catalogs, but really listening to every word. "Joe, I hate to say this, but I think we need to face reality here. You've always been better with your hands than with numbers. Maybe you signed some things without fully understanding what they meant." My grandfather's face crumpled like he'd been slapped. "Eddie, I may not be college-educated like you, But I'm not stupid. I know what I signed and what I didn't. Of course you're not stupid. But running a business is complicated. There are regulations, tax implications, legal requirements that most people don't understand. It's possible you made some innocent mistakes that are now catching up with us. The manipulation was masterful. Eddie wasn't calling my grandfather stupid. He was being understanding about how complex business ownership could be for a simple working man. He wasn't accusing Joe of wrongdoing. He was suggesting that honest mistakes had led to these problems. Maybe we should consider dissolving the partnership before things get worse. I could buy out your share, take over the debts, start fresh with a clean slate. I wanted to scream. I wanted to leap out of my chair and shake my grandfather until he saw what was happening. But what proof did I have? Suspicions and hunches and women's intuition weren't evidence. And Eddie Morrison was family. The second major blow came just before Christmas, landing like a sledgehammer to the chest. I was at my parents' house helping my mother wrap presents and trying to pretend everything was normal when Grandpa Joe called. I could barely understand him through his sobs, great wrenching sounds that seemed to tear something loose in his chest. The bank was foreclosing. Not just on the business, on his house. The house his father had built with his own hands in 1943. The house where he'd brought his bride in 1950. The house where my mother had taken her first steps and spoken her first words. The house where 4 generations of our family had lived and loved and dreamed. Because of that second loan, the one for purchasing the garage building, his house had been used as additional collateral. Eddie's signature was on those papers too, right next to my grandfather's. But somehow Eddie's house was protected in a trust that made it untouchable. Funny how that worked out. When I got to Grandpa Joe's house, I found him in his bedroom, pulling photo albums from the closet. Not packing to move, just holding memories like they might disappear if he let go. The albums were old and worn, filled with black and white photographs of family gatherings, birthday parties, Christmas mornings around the tree in the living room downstairs. 43 years I've lived in this house, he whispered, his voice hollow as wind through empty rooms. Your grandmother planted those roses by the front porch when your mother was born. I built that swing in the backyard when you were 5. Remember? You said it needed to be strong enough for elephants. I remembered everything. The way the morning light slanted through the kitchen windows, casting golden rectangles on the linoleum floor where my grandmother had taught me to make biscuits. The creaky third step on the staircase that you had to step over if you wanted to sneak downstairs on Christmas morning. The smell of Old Spice and coffee that seemed permanently embedded in the walls. It wasn't just Grandpa Joe losing his home. It was all of us losing a piece of our history. Our anchor. Our place in the world. There has to be something we can do, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. We could fight the foreclosure, hire a lawyer, prove that you didn't understand what you were signing. But Grandpa Joe just shook his head. Who's going to believe an old man over Eddie Morrison? He's a police detective, Sarah. He's got 30 years of service and a spotless reputation. I'm just a construction worker who got in over his head. The defeat in his voice broke something in me. That night I confronted Eddie. I found him at Murphy's Tavern, holding court with his police buddies at a corner table, laughing over drinks like he didn't have a care in the world. The tavern was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of cheap beer. Country music playing on the jukebox while men in flannel shirts played pool in the back. Eddie was in his element. The respected detective, the pillar of the community, the man everyone looked up to. When I asked to speak with him privately, his jovial mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw something cold and calculating flash in his eyes. We stepped outside into the December cold, our breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The parking lot was lit by a single streetlight that cast harsh shadows across Eddie's face, making him look older, harder. Sarah, honey, I know you're upset about your grandfather, but where's the money, Eddie? The question hung in the air between us like smoke from his cigarette. 4-3 heartbeats, his face showed nothing. No surprise, no confusion, no concern. Just a careful blankness that told me everything I needed to know. Then the mask was back in place. What money? Sarah, we're all devastated about what's happening. Sometimes businesses fail even when everyone involved has the best intentions. It's nobody's fault. But I'd seen it. That flash of something cold and predatory behind his eyes. The way he glanced around to make sure nobody from the tavern had followed us outside. The careful way he chose his words, like a man who'd practiced this conversation. My grandfather trusted you. He trusted you with everything. And I've done everything I can to help him. But Joe, your grandfather made some poor decisions. The expansion was too aggressive. He was in over his head financially. Eddie leaned closer and I caught the scent of expensive cologne underneath the beer on his breath. Cologne that cost more than a detective's salary should have allowed. Between you and me, I think the stress might be affecting his memory. He's been confused lately. Forgetting conversations we've had, signatures he's made. Said really. The aging process can be cruel. The bastard was setting up my grandfather to look incompetent. Planting seeds of doubt about Joe's mental state. You're lying. Eddie's smile never wavered, but his voice dropped to a whisper that carried more menace than any shout. Be very careful, Sarah. Your grandfather is about to lose everything. It would be a shame if he lost his family's respect too. People might start asking questions about his mental state, his ability to make sound decisions, whether he should be living alone. The threat was subtle but crystal clear. Eddie Morrison was a respected police detective with 30 years of service and a spotless reputation. He had connections, influence, the power to make life very difficult for anyone who crossed him. Grandpa Joe was just a confused old man who'd made bad business decisions. Who would people believe? I see you, Eddie Morrison. I see exactly what you are. And what am I, Sarah? A thief. A liar. A man who destroys the people who love him. Eddie's laugh was soft and utterly without humor. Prove it. He flicked his cigarette butt into the darkness and walked back into the tavern, leaving me standing alone in the cold with the terrible knowledge that he was right. I couldn't prove anything. That's when the third and final shoe dropped. 3 days after New Year's 1984, Detective Eddie Morrison arrived at my grandfather's house with 2 other officers and a warrant for his arrest. Someone had been stealing from Morrison & Sons Auto Repair. Cash payments from customers had been pocketed instead of deposited. Checks had been forged to divert business funds to personal accounts. Equipment and parts had been sold and the money kept for personal use. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank statements showing deposits to an account in Grandpa Joe's name, an account he swore he'd never opened. Handwriting analysis that claimed the forged signatures matched his writing style. Customer testimony about paying cash to the old man, and being told not to worry about receipts. I'm sorry, Joe, Eddie said as they placed the handcuffs around my grandfather's wrists. His voice was thick with emotion, tears actually glistening in his eyes. I trusted you like a brother. I never imagined you were capable of this. The performance was masterful. Eddie Morrison, the heartbroken friend and business partner, victim of his childhood buddy's criminal behavior. Eddie Morrison, the honest cop who'd done everything by the book and been betrayed by someone he'd loved like family. Even some of our family friends believed it. After all, Grandpa Joe had been acting strange lately. Forgetful. Confused. Angry and defensive when people asked about the business. Maybe the stress of business ownership had pushed him over the edge. Maybe he really had started taking money that wasn't his. Maybe he really was guilty. I knew better. But knowing and proving are 2 different things entirely. The local newspaper ran the story on the front page. Local business owner arrested for embezzlement. The article painted a picture of a trusted member of the community who'd fallen from grace. A man whose greed had destroyed a promising business partnership. Eddie Morrison was quoted extensively, talking about how difficult it had been to discover his best friend's crimes, how he tried to give Joe a chance to make things right before involving the police. This is the hardest thing I've ever had to do, Eddie told the reporter. But I swore an oath to uphold the law even when it means turning in someone I love. The community rallied around Eddie. He was the victim here, the honest cop who'd been betrayed by his oldest friend. Church ladies brought him casseroles. His fellow officers patted him on the back and told him he'd done the right thing. Meanwhile, my grandfather sat in a jail cell, waiting for a trial that would determine whether he'd spend his final years in prison for crimes he didn't commit. The trial lasted 3 weeks and felt like 3 years. Eddie testified with tears in his eyes about how he'd discovered the discrepancies in the books, how he'd confronted Joe privately and given him a chance to explain, how it had broken his heart to involve the police. He painted himself as the reluctant hero, the man who'd put justice above friendship. The prosecution's case was airtight. They had documentation showing missing money, expert testimony about the forged signatures, witness statements from customers who'd paid cash and received no receipts. They painted a picture of an elderly man desperate to maintain his lifestyle, who'd seen an opportunity to steal from his own business and taken it. Grandpa Joe's lawyer was a public defender named Robert Chin, a young man fresh out of law school who was overwhelmed and underprepared for a case this complex. When he tried to suggest that Eddie Morrison might have been the real thief, the prosecutor objected on grounds of character assassination. After all, Detective Morrison had an impeccable reputation. 30 years of distinguished service. Commendations from his superiors. The respect of the entire community. Who was going to believe that such a man would frame his best friend? The jury deliberated for 2 hours, barely long enough to elect a foreman and take a lunch break. Guilty on all counts. Grandpa Joe was sentenced to 5 years in state prison. At 66 years old, with a bad back and a broken heart, he was led away in shackles to serve time for crimes he didn't commit. Eddie Morrison stood in the courthouse hallway afterward, accepting condolences from colleagues and community members. Playing the role of the grieving friend to perfection, talking about how this experience had shown him how quickly good people could lose their way. I watched him from across the room, this man who'd eaten at our dinner table for 40 years, who'd bounced me on his knee when I was little, who'd given a speech at my engagement party about the importance of trust in relationships. And I swore that someday somehow I would prove what he'd done. But 40 years passed. 40 years of carrying that knowledge like a stone in my chest, watching Eddie Morrison live like a king while my grandfather rotted in prison and died alone. Grandpa Joe served 3 years before his heart gave out. He never got to walk me down the aisle at my wedding. Never got to hold his great-grandchildren or see them take their first steps. He died branded as a thief and betrayer, forgotten by a community that had once respected him. Eddie Morrison retired with full honors and a pension that seemed remarkably generous for a small-town detective. He bought a mansion in the hills overlooking the town, drove luxury cars, took expensive vacations to Europe and the Caribbean. All paid for with money he'd stolen from my grandfather. For 40 years, I watched him live in prosperity while our family struggled with the shame and financial devastation he'd caused. I watched him play the role of the respected retired police officer, the pillar of the community, the man who'd sacrificed so much in service to justice. Until last Tuesday morning, when karma finally came calling. "Mrs. Patterson, are you sitting down?" Detective Morrison's voice on the phone that Tuesday morning was gentle but urgent. Not Eddie Morrison, his son. Marcus Morrison, who'd grown up playing in our backyard, who'd called my grandfather Uncle Joe, until the day of the trial when everything changed forever. Marcus. I hadn't spoken to him in decades. After his father destroyed my family, the children had chosen sides as children do in situations like this. Some stayed loyal to their parents, others disappeared entirely from our lives. "How did you get this number? I need to see you. Today. It's about my father, and your grandfather." Something in his voice made my coffee mug slip from my hands. Something raw and broken and desperate, like a dam about to burst after years of holding back too much pressure. "What about them?" "My father is dying, Mrs. Patterson. Pancreatic cancer. He has maybe 2 weeks left, probably less." I felt nothing at that news. No satisfaction, no sorrow. Just emptiness where my anger used to live. 40 years of rage had burned itself out, leaving only ash and exhaustion. "I'm sorry for your family's loss, Marcus, but I don't see what," he confessed. The words hit me like a physical blow, like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart until it stopped beating. The kitchen around me seemed to tilt and blur, the familiar walls and cabinets becoming foreign and strange. What? 2 nights ago, when the morphine wasn't helping and he thought he was alone, he started talking. About Uncle Joe. About the garage. About what really happened. My legs gave out. I sank into the kitchen chair where I'd sat 40 years ago, trying to make sense of bank statements and lies, surrounded by evidence of a betrayal so deep it had taken my breath away. "I recorded it," Marcus whispered, his voice breaking. "I had my phone on because I wanted to capture his last words, you know? For my kids. Something to remember their grandfather by. But instead I got this." He was crying now. This grown man, this police detective like his father, was sobbing into the phone with the ugly, wrenching sounds of someone whose world had just collapsed. "Mrs. Patterson, my father destroyed an innocent man. He stole everything from Uncle Joe and let him die in prison for crimes he didn't commit. And I have proof." The next 3 hours passed in a blur of shock and disbelief. I called my daughter Jennifer, who drove down from Sacramento to be with me. I called my son David, who promised to catch the next flight from San Diego. I sat in my living room, staring at the framed photograph of Grandpa Joe that I'd kept on my mantle for 40 years, and tried to process what Marcus had told me. Eddie Morrison had confessed. After 4 decades of lies, the truth was finally coming out. Marcus picked me up at 2 o'clock, his face drawn and aged beyond his 50-something years. The drive to the sheriff's department was silent except for the sound of his shaking hands on the steering wheel and the occasional sob that escaped his lips. In the parking lot before we went inside, he turned to me with eyes that looked exactly like his father's had at that age. I believed him, Mrs. Patterson. All these years I believed Uncle Joe was guilty. I thought he'd betrayed our family. You were a child. I was old enough to know better. Old enough to remember who Uncle Joe really was. The man who taught me to fish, who came to my little league games when my father had to work, who slipped me candy when my mother wasn't looking. That man wasn't capable of theft. Your father was very convincing. My father was a monster. The words came out harsh and bitter. And I spent 40 years defending him. Inside the sheriff's department, Marcus played the recording for Detective Sarah Chin, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and an expression that grew more grim with each passing minute. Eddie Morrison's voice, weakened by disease but still unmistakably his, rambling in a morphine haze about offshore accounts and forged signatures and a plan he'd called foolproof. Joe was so trusting, never questioned anything I put in front of him, just signed whatever I asked him to sign. Stupid old bastard made it so easy. I had to close my eyes and grip the arms of my chair to keep from screaming. Hearing my grandfather described that way, hearing the contempt in Eddie's voice for a man who'd loved him like a brother, was almost unbearable. Smart thing was using his own trust against him. Joe would have signed his own death warrant if I'd asked him to. Loyalty makes people weak. Makes them perfect victims. The recording was 27 minutes long. 27 minutes of Eddie Morrison detailing exactly how he'd embezzled over $200,000 from their business, how he'd opened accounts in Grandpa Joe's name, how he'd coached customers to lie on the witness stand. Best part was watching him in court, still believing I was trying to help him, still thinking I was his friend. The look on his face when they read the verdict, priceless. Marcus stopped the recording. We sat in silence in Detective Chen's office, 2 middle-aged people grappling with a truth that had taken 40 years to surface, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of phones ringing. I was 12 when your grandfather went to prison, Marcus finally said. I believed my father. We all did. I thought Uncle Joe had betrayed us, when all along it was the other way around. He loved you kids. The words came out sharper than I intended, 40 years of suppressed grief and anger finally finding a target. He used to ask about you in his letters from prison. Even after everything your father did, he still cared about you. Still worried about whether you were doing well in school, whether you were happy. Marcus broke down then. 40 years of suppressed guilt and confused loyalty pouring out in ugly, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from the very core of his being. I should have known. I should have seen it. My father wasn't the same after that trial. He had money, expensive things, but he was different, colder. Like something had died in him. Conscience, I said. That's what died in him. Whatever humanity he had left. Detective Chin leaned forward across her desk, her expression serious but compassionate. Mrs. Patterson, this is complicated. The statute of limitations has run out on the embezzlement charges. We can't prosecute him for the financial crimes. My heart sank. Even with a confession, even with proof, Eddie Morrison would escape justice again. But, she continued, perjury in a felony case has no statute of limitations in California. And this recording, combined with other evidence we can now re-examine with fresh eyes, we can charge him with obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and perjury. Will it matter? He's dying anyway. Detective Chen's expression softened. It matters because it clears your grandfather's name. Officially. It matters because the truth finally comes out. And it matters because there may be other victims. Other cases where Detective Morrison's testimony was crucial to convictions. That afternoon, arrest warrants were issued for Edward Morrison. Not that it mattered in any practical sense. He was unconscious in hospice care, his body finally failing him the way his conscience had failed him 40 years ago. But the warrants existed. The charges were filed. And for the first time since 1984, the Millbrook County Courthouse records showed that Joseph Patrick Sullivan was not a criminal. He was a victim. The truth had finally come to light. Eddie Morrison died 4 days later without ever regaining consciousness. He never had to face a courtroom or answer for his crimes in any legal sense. But somehow that felt right to me. Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's simply about truth. The story broke in the local newspaper first. Respected former detective confesses to framing business partner. The headline was stark black letters against white newsprint, but to me it might as well have been written in gold. Then it spread to regional news outlets, picked up by television stations in Sacramento and San Francisco. Finally, national outlets got hold of it. CNN, Fox News, even the New York Times ran pieces about the small-town cop who'd fooled everyone for 40 years. The narrative was irresistible. The corrupt detective who destroyed an innocent man, the deathbed confession that changed everything, the family's 4-decade fight for justice. Reporters called it a modern-day morality tale, a reminder that the truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deeply it's buried. For weeks my phone rang constantly. Reporters wanting interviews, their voices breathless with excitement over this story that had everything: betrayal, corruption, family loyalty, and ultimate vindication. True crime podcasters offered to feature our story. Documentary filmmakers pitched series about wrongful convictions and police corruption. It was overwhelming. Lawyers descended like locusts, offering to help us sue everyone involved in my grandfather's prosecution. The city of Millbrook, the county district attorney's office, the state of California, anyone who'd had a role in convicting an innocent man. They spoke in dollar amounts that made my head spin, talking about wrongful imprisonment settlements and civil rights violations and the money that could never undo the damage but might at least acknowledge it. Old friends and neighbors called to apologize, to express their shock, to admit they'd harbored doubts all along but never spoken up. "I always wondered about Eddie," became a common refrain, though most of these people had said nothing when their wondering might have made a difference. Too little too late. My cousin Michael, my mother's sister's boy, called from Portland where he'd been living since the trial. He'd been 16 in 1984, old enough to understand what was happening but too young to question the adults around him. I believed them, Aunt Sarah. I believed Eddie was the victim and Uncle Joe was the criminal. I'm so ashamed. You were a child, Michael. We all believed what we were told to believe. But the call that mattered most came on a Sunday evening, 2 weeks after Eddie's death, while I was sitting in my garden watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Mrs. Patterson? This is Governor Newsom's office. The governor would like to speak with you about a posthumous pardon for your grandfather." Posthumous pardon. Official recognition that Joseph Patrick Sullivan had been wrongly convicted, that the state of California acknowledged its mistake and wanted to set the record straight. It wouldn't bring Grandpa Joe back, wouldn't give him the chance to walk me down the aisle or hold his great-grandchildren, but it would clear his name. Finally, officially, completely. The ceremony was held at the state capitol in Sacramento on a crisp October morning when the leaves were just beginning to turn. The building was magnificent, all marble columns and soaring ceilings, the kind of place where important things happened and history was made. My children and grandchildren were there, 3 generations gathered to witness something that should have happened 40 years ago. My daughter Jennifer had flown in from Chicago with her twins, teenage boys who'd grown up hearing stories about their great-great-grandfather's fight for justice. My son David came from San Diego with his family, including my youngest granddaughter who was only 7 but understood that this was important, that Grandma was getting something back that had been stolen from her. Marcus Morrison was there too with his family, standing apart from our group but present nonetheless. His face was drawn and aged, his shoulders bent under the weight of his father's legacy. We'd spoken several times since that terrible phone call, and I could see the guilt eating away at him like acid. "You don't have to carry your father's sins," I'd told him. "You did the right thing when it mattered. But forgiveness is easier to give than to accept," and Marcus Morrison was learning that the hard way. Governor Newsom spoke about the importance of truth, about the courage it takes to admit when the system fails, about how my grandfather's story reminded us that justice delayed is not justice denied if we're willing to keep fighting for it. His words echoed in the great chamber, bouncing off marble walls and reaching into corners where shadows had hidden for too long. When he handed me the official pardon documents, heavy paper, impressive seals, signatures that carried the weight of the state, I thought about Grandpa Joe. About how he died alone in a prison infirmary, branded as a thief, convinced that the whole world believed he was guilty. "This is for you, Grandpa," I whispered to the papers in my hands. "You were innocent. Everyone knows now." The media attention brought unexpected consequences. Within days of the governor's ceremony, I received a call from a law firm in San Francisco representing victims of wrongful conviction. They'd been following our story and had discovered something that made my heart race. The money was mostly gone, of course. Eddie had hidden it too well, spent it too cleverly over the decades. Offshore accounts and shell companies and investments that had been liquidated years ago. His widow, Susan, claimed complete ignorance of her husband's crimes, and maybe she was telling the truth. Maybe she'd lived 40 years believing her husband was the honorable man he'd pretended to be. I chose to believe her for her children's sake. But the house, my grandfather's house, that was a different story entirely. It turned out that when the bank foreclosed in 1984, Eddie Morrison had been the high bidder at the sheriff's auction. Using his stolen money, he'd bought my grandfather's home for a fraction of its value and immediately transferred ownership to a holding company he controlled. For 40 years he'd rented it out to other families while the money flowed into his accounts. Blood money from the destruction of an innocent man, profit from a crime that had never been solved. The legal team that had taken our case pro bono after the story broke filed suit against Eddie Morrison's estate for unjust enrichment and fraud. Within 6 months we had a settlement. The house would be returned to our family, along with 40 years of rental income, adjusted for inflation. Nearly $2 million in total. Justice takes many forms. On the day I got the keys back, I stood on the front porch where my grandfather used to sit in the evenings, watching the sunset and waving to neighbors who passed by on their evening walks. The roses my grandmother had planted were still there, though much larger now, climbing up a trellis some tenant had added over the years. The house needed work. New floors to replace the linoleum that had been damaged by decades of different families. Fresh paint to cover the marks left by children who'd grown up in rooms that should have been filled with my family's laughter. Updated wiring and plumbing to bring it into the modern era. But the bones were good. My great-grandfather had built it to last, with thick walls and solid foundations that could weather any storm. My oldest grandson Jason was with me that day. He's 25 now, just 2 years older than I was when Grandpa Joe was arrested and our world fell apart. He'd grown up hearing stories about his great-great-grandfather, about injustice and betrayal and the importance of fighting for truth even when it seems hopeless. "Are you going to live here, Grandma?" he asked, running his hands along the porch railing my grandfather had carved by hand, feeling the smooth wood that had been worn smooth by decades of use. I looked out at the street where I'd played as a child, where my mother had learned to ride a bicycle, where 4 generations of our family had built their lives and dreams. "No, sweetheart. I have my own home now, my own life. But we'll keep it in the family. Maybe you'll want to raise your children here someday." Would great-great-grandpa Joe like that? I closed my eyes and felt the California sunshine on my face, the same sunshine that had warmed my grandfather's shoulders as he worked in the yard all those decades ago. I could almost hear his voice on the wind, see his smile in the dappled light filtering through the oak tree he'd planted when my mother was born. "He'd love it," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "He'd absolutely love it." Marcus Morrison reached out to me 6 months after his father's death. He'd been going through Eddie's papers, he said, trying to settle the estate and understand how long the deception had lasted, how deep the corruption had gone. He found things that made my blood run cold. Bank statements from the 1980s that confirmed everything on the deathbed recording and more. Handwriting samples that proved Eddie had forged my grandfather's signature on dozens of documents. Notes in Eddie's own hand detailing exactly how to frame his best friend, complete with timelines and contingency plans. The man had been planning this for months. There were other victims too. Elderly clients whose wills Eddie had witnessed and who'd left unexpected bequests to charitable organizations that turned out to be shell companies Eddie controlled. Evidence cases where money or valuables had gone missing and been written off as lost or stolen. A pattern of corruption stretching back decades. "I don't know what to do with all this," Marcus said when we met for coffee at a diner outside town, away from curious eyes and gossiping neighbors. "Part of me wants to burn it all and pretend it never happened. But that would be betraying Uncle Joe all over again, wouldn't it?" His face was haggard, aged beyond his 50-something years. Learning that your father was a monster takes a toll that can't be measured in words. Your father spent 40 years living with what he'd done, I told him. Don't you spend the rest of your life carrying his guilt. You're not responsible for his crimes. But I benefited from them. The college tuition he paid, the car he bought me for graduation, the down payment on my first house. It was all stolen money, wasn't it? I reached across the table and covered his weathered hand with mine. You were a child. You didn't know. And more importantly, you did the right thing when you learned the truth. That matters more than anything else. Marcus donated everything to the California Innocence Project, an organization that works to exonerate the wrongly convicted and prevent future injustices. They'll use Eddie Morrison's papers to teach law students about prosecutorial misconduct, about how corruption can poison entire cases, about the importance of questioning official narratives even when they come from trusted sources. From evil, sometimes good can grow. The hardest part of this entire journey wasn't forgiving Eddie Morrison. He was dead and my anger had died with him. The hardest part was forgiving myself for not fighting harder when I was 23, for not pushing back more forcefully against the narrative that painted my grandfather as guilty, for not finding a way to prove what I knew in my heart to be true. But my therapist, yes, at 62 I finally started seeing a therapist to help process 4 decades of suppressed trauma, helped me understand that I'd been young and powerless, up against a system designed to protect its own. The police, the prosecutors, the courts, they all had incentives to believe Eddie Morrison's version of events and dismiss the claims of a confused old man and his naive granddaughter. You never stopped believing in his innocence, Dr. Martinez reminded me during one of our sessions. That's what mattered. That's what kept his memory alive long enough for the truth to surface. Without your faith, without your refusal to accept the official story, this injustice might never have been exposed. Today there's a small memorial bench in Millbrook Central Park with my grandfather's name engraved on a bronze plaque. The inscription reads, Joseph Patrick Sullivan, 1918 to 1987. Wrongly accused, finally vindicated. A reminder that truth and justice sometimes take time, but they're always worth the wait. Marcus Morrison helped pay for it. He said it was the least he could do, though I told him he owed us nothing. The sins of the father don't transfer to the son, especially when the son has spent years trying to make amends for crimes he didn't commit. The bench sits under an oak tree facing the sunset, in a spot where children play and families gather for picnics. Sometimes I sit there in the evenings watching the light fade from the sky and thinking about my grandfather. About the man he was, the life he should have lived, the legacy he deserved to leave behind. He was innocent. The whole world knows that now. And sometimes that's enough. If you've made it this far, thank you for walking this road with me. I hope this story gave you strength, or at least the feeling that you're not alone. Comment where you're watching from and maybe subscribe. Let's build a place where voices like mine, and maybe even yours, are finally heard.